All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning to the Sands of Time podcast. I'm your host, Tarek Ibrahim, and I am with Mujir and Muneeruddin. By the way, Mujir,
Yes.
your name, Muneeruddin, when you take that out and make it into, let's say, Arabic, for lack of better words, is it Min Nuruddin? Actually, like Min Nur?
No, I mean, that's actually true to the meaning of the name.
Yeah.
I would say Muneeruddin, the enlightener of the faith.
Oh, I see.
Min an-nur, but you're right. Min nur, the
Right,
etymology is Munir comes min nur.
Min Nur, right?
Correct. So,
You know, I spent some time on it the other day, and I'm like, you know what?
but
what a beautiful
pronunciation
last
of my
name.
family is Muneeruddin.
That's right, Muneeruddin. That's
the
right.
illuminators of the faith.
The illuminators of the faith. Yeah. And I'm just Ibrahim, but hey, you can't knock that.
All good. If you want, you can call me by my tribal name, which is Farouqi. Mujir Muneeruddin al-Farouqi.
Oh, that's actually on a
my passport, but that's my family.
That's
name.
your family name.
Farouqi. Yeah.
Hey, can't go wrong with that. So we have a great show. I'm sure you know. We've been talking about this for a little bit, and one thing that I've constantly been looking at in history is there's a moment in time during the Abbasid Khalifa, right? And you have this moment where you thought something good potentially was going to happen, and then the complete opposite happens, as though their life has this certain trajectory for it. I think everyone can relate to this, is that you make your plan, you decide this is what you're going to do, and then all of a sudden the opposite happens, right? Yeah. And what I'm referring to is the exact moment, and I think this subject will actually relate to a whole bunch of other things, family, siblings, all this sort of thing. But when we're talking about Harun al-Rashid and his two sons,
Oh yeah.
right? And you have this moment in time where one brother was super religious, super good, you know what I mean? Everyone loved them in the city. And then you had the other brother, arguably not as good, to be politically correct.
But in some ways, he was more loved by the elite. Muhammad al-Amin.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he was more loved by the elite, but not as religious, not as pious. That's right. That's that fine line I'm trying to make. And then somewhere along the line, when you're trying to pick which son to lead, and this can be into different scenarios in everyday life, like in business. Okay, you have your sons, who's going to be the better kid to rule, or who's going to be the best one to be responsible, who's going to lead the family afterwards. Like when you're planning, sometimes the plan doesn't go to plan, if you will. And what I wanted to bring up today, because I think this is very good, when you have these two sons, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of people's opinion, al-Ma'mun, right, shouldn't necessarily have been the one to lead. And al-Amin perhaps should have been the one to lead.
So Ma'mun was the one that ended up taking the conch.
Right.
He never had any business being in power. It never should have happened, in the sense that if you look at it from a historic perspective, the probability of him getting into that role was very low. And this entire story is full of a cajillion ironies.
Well, that's why I wanted to bring it up, right? Because everything people would expect to happen didn't happen.
Do you remember in the pilot we talked about one of the biggest flaws of our reading of history is determinism. We assume that because everything in history followed a certain path, that it was always going to happen that way. This is a classic case of God taking the probability of something occurring from a very low position. Ma'mun is in a 2, 3, 5% position to ever take the entire Khilafah, and turning it upside its head and changing the entire course of Islamic history. And that's a very underrated fact. Most Muslims know to a certain extent about the Abbasis taking it from the Umayyads. They know about the first fitna between Imam Ali and Amir Muawiyah. They know about Sayyidina Uthman being killed. They don't realize how pivotal, from a panoptic perspective, this one moment in civil war, the fourth fitna as they call it, in 812 AD, how important that was and how transformative that was long-term in Islamic civilization, not even civilization, Islamic theological tradition. You think it's politics, and our aqidah has always developed outside state interference and function, but the two things were not always such.
Yeah, and I think it's important to even bring up the fact that this story, this family, this moment in time is so pivotal, because you have the father, right, Harun al-Rashid.
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly a guy loved by the masses, right?
Yeah.
He goes into the streets, he talks to the people, he checks in on them, he takes his kids with him, and he's always with his kids.
By all accounts, he's a very religious man.
By all accounts, he's a very religious man. And this is the point that I think every parent always has to pay attention to, because these stories are great and as we said in the initial version of the pilot, that this is for leadership. These things are meant to be leadership. And then if you don't take these nuggets and actually put them in your life to see that, hey, you could be the leader of the world at that time. And you are confident that you are raising two upright children.
Yeah.
You're walking through the city, showing that you humble yourself to the people, that you help the people.
Yep.
And you got completely different kids running amok, more to be quite accurate.
And this is something we've seen with the prophets of God, alayhim salam. Nabi Sulaiman, in the Bible, his son ends up being a total fasiq that destroys the entire mamlaka al-Yaqubi. Destroys the entire kingdom. You go further back to Nabi Nuh alayhi salam. His son, according to Islamic tradition, shouldn't even be considered a son because he is diametrically opposite in his religious views. So if Anbiya Allah can't always necessarily marshal their children along the lines of Hidayah, who are mortal kings?
Who are people? Absolutely right.
So who are we here?
Yeah, we don't stand a chance, realistically speaking. And I think that's important for people to really grasp that concept, because a lot of people will beat themselves up,
And by the way, can I go ahead and that son that ends up being a total fasiq, Muhammad al-Amin, he has a great name. He's literally named for the Prophet ﷺ. His mother, Zubaydah, is even more pious than his dad.
Yeah.
She's known as the one that created the canal, for example, that would give water to all the Hajis going from Baghdad and Iraq to Hajj and all the Mu'tamirin. She is also known for her particular quarters being considered the beehive because it was always buzzing with the recitation of the Qur'an. Incredible. This woman is famed for her piety. And the irony of the story is her son, al-Amin, ends up being the one who is a sot. He is very hedonistic. He has no interest really in religion or theology. He's more into ostentation, court intrigues, and wowing people with things that you would expect a playboy king to be involved with. And his half-brother, al-Ma'mun, who's from the slave girl concubine of Khurasan, is actually very religious, maybe to a heretical degree, in fact, if you look at it historically. But he's very much given to his faith, and his faith is very important to him. He's very knowledgeable. He's very educated. He's very well-versed to a fault, as we'll get into it. And I want to really contextualize the entire irony here with how different the Abbasids were from the Umayyads. And some of that was by design. They almost wanted to be the exact opposite of what the Umayyads represented themselves to being or how people remembered them. But in so doing, they created a movement that actually weakened them and gave the power back to the Ummah, the everyday people, and in fact created what I would say is one of the first instances of constitutional rule and the rule of law at least in the medieval period. I don't know that it existed before that, but certainly in the medieval period, it was the most pronounced case of constitutional rule of law and monarchy. That was in the Islamic world, and this transcended many empires. The Abbasids had this constitutional monarchy where the ulema were the arbiters of the faith and theology, judging the Caliph by whether he implemented Aqidah, Islamic law, and conformed to the norms of the Orthodoxy. And they were fully independent judges, qadis, muftis. The Mamluks carried this forward. The Ottomans, maybe more so than anybody before them, represented this, and we'll get into examples. But let's take a step back to 750 AD. The Abbasids have just taken over. Abu al-Abbas al-Safah and his brother Abu Ja'far al-Mansur are ostensibly a lot more religious than the Umayyads, who were really the Sadat al-Quraysh, and they dialed back a lot of the days and elements of ignorance that reflected the pre-prophetic period of the early 7th and late 6th century. The Abbasids come in. They're a lot more learned on Islamic matters. Their legitimacy to rule is more predicated upon religious lines and foundations. They claim to be from Abbas, who is radiyallahu ta'ala an, the uncle, the of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they're saying that they are Ahlul Bayt, and the Quraysh are, the Umayyads are the Quraysh, and so they are basically the symbolic ones that are trying to hurt the family of the Prophet, and we are the Abbasis, the family of the Prophet, bringing Islam back from the members of the Jahiliyyah, the vanguards of Jahiliyyah. They really rode that mantra and narrative to victory in 750.
I actually take that as a lesson, to be honest, because in public relations, you want people to believe, right? And you know, the Abbasids would never have probably gotten as far as they would have if they didn't do that sort of quote unquote PR move, in the sense that they really got the people to believe that they are going to be the ones to continue the not just the political system that the Prophet Muhammad put in place, but also the holiness of it, that it's going to be like a religious empire versus what the Umayyads did. And history will show what ends up happening.
And the Umayyads being so clueless on that ultimately is what brought about that demise, because they actually had no idea.
They didn't feel that
the Abbasis were running and winning on that campaign.
That's
and
right.
We had a whole episode, a couple of episodes on the Umayyads, so people know exactly at this point how we feel about the Umayyads and why they failed. But the Abbasis are in some ways the same but very different. So they're the same in the sense that they're not the Khulafa al-Rashidun. These are not heavenly people that are rightly guided and making the right determination from a theological, creedal perspective for Muslims. So you and I, if we're studying the Abbasis and all their great kings with a microscope, we're not coming away saying, oh man, rahimahullah ta'ala anhum. It's nothing like that. They're nothing like the Sahabis.
They're human beings.
Abu al-Abbas comes in, he executes under treachery every single Umayyad.
Yeah.
And in many cases, he's inviting them under a banner of peace, come to my house for dinner, or my Ammu's house for dinner. He executes them all. There's a general, I believe in Sham, who is a high-ranking Umayyad, and they say, look, if you capitulate, we'll give you full amnesty and passage. When he capitulates and surrenders, they kill him. That's not Islamic at all. That's against the Sharia, against the fiqh. But this period is characterized as the Caliphs and the Amirs not being bound by the fiqh and the Aqidah and the Sharia the way that people after the Mihna are. So what ends up happening is the Abbasis are more religious and they're more theologically inclined. And I know people, to take a step back, I know people are going to say, well, the Umayyads killed all kinds of shuyukh. And of course, for sure, the Umayyads killed Imam Hussein, no doubt about it. They killed Abdullah ibn Umar, radiyallahu an. They, radiyallahu anhuma, both, Imam Hussein as well. Abdullah ibn Zubair, they killed as well, radiyallahu an. They killed Sa'id bin Jubair. They killed all kinds of shuyukh. But their opposition to these shuyukh and ulema and these kibar were more from the perspective of politics. They're simply trying to crush anybody who is politically opposed to them. They're not actually trying to manipulate the faith in a systematic way, the way the Abbasis later would. The Abbasis, when they take over, they actually see religion as a tool that they can manipulate to underpin their rule even more robustly. Right off the bat, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the second king, one of the most influential and impactful, he tries to get Imam Abu Hanifa to become his Grand Mufti. So he writes him a letter famously, and I'll paraphrase the early sources, but the story goes something like this. He writes to Imam Abu Hanifa, I want you to be my chief qadi and my Mufti al-Azim. Imam Abu Hanifa is a sheikh, and he's a zahid in some ways. He wants nothing to do with politics, and he definitely doesn't want to be a dupe for some monarchy. He writes back saying, I am unqualified for that role. So Abu Ja'far is now offended because how dare you say no to me, you lowly little sheikh. And then he says, you're a liar. You are the most qualified person in the entire ummah to fill this office. Imam Abu Hanifa, not giving a flying, you know what, writes him back saying, I agree, and therefore you are doubly correct. As a liar and a fasik, I am not qualified to fill that role. Obviously, Abu Ja'far, if you know anything about him, he's not going to take kindly to something like that. He locks up Imam Abu Hanifa. He's tortured and imprisoned. And this really kicks off a pattern among the Abbasids where they are going to try and get ulama and shuyukh, not actually like the Umayyads, eliminated for their opposition. They're going to try and co-opt them and bring them onto the cause because they realize that the key to legitimacy is theocracy. If we're with the ulama and our rulings have the weight of shariah and aqidah, well then we're infallible. And that's really what characterizes a theocracy, is a ruler, the divine right of kings in some ways. The king or the ruler is supposed to have the weight of God behind him. And so therefore you can't even question him, you can't oppose him. That's not actually how Islamic civilization, the sultans and the caliphs after this period came to rule. And that's not how Islamic legal theory was at all. And it's all thanks to the Mihna. This pattern begins to escalate after Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. You have Harun al-Rashid, who, for different reasons, wants to get Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq was persecuted by Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. So these are huge shuyukh. Yeah. Imam Musa al-Kazim. Yeah. You have Harun al-Rashid feeling jealous that, okay, this man is getting very powerful, and at first he wants to bring him on board, but Imam Musa al-Kazim is more of the Ahl al-Bayt Imam Ali variety. He's from that nasl, he's from that lineage, and the Abbasids are from the other branch of the family. They're from the Abbasi side, and this is from the Abu Talib side, the Alis, the Fariq Ali. So he tries to imprison and persecute him, and it's really part of the systematic attempt to get the ulama on board or silence them. And it's theological because this is coming from the perspective of religiosity.
Yeah, because they wanted to show that they're the legitimate rule. They're trying to show that because they won it. And I think that the context is so more here, right? They won it, and they took the title from the Umayyads because they said, we are going to be religious. We are religious. Not only are we religious, we're the Ahl al-Bayt. That's right. So that claim, especially from Musa, because he is so related to Imam Ali, they needed him. Realistically, they needed him. And by not having him on board, they're really allowing for another rebellion to grow. And they've spent all their time, as far as I'm concerned, squashing rebellion. So these are dangerous figures in their minds. This is politics. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly. One unique thing for people to be aware of the Abbasi period, especially the early Abbasi period, Islamic Aqidah, theology, and orthodoxy is still crystallizing in the first 1 or 2 centuries after the Prophet ﷺ. Remember that hadith aren't fully compiled and canonized and verified by the 2 Imam Sahih Muslim and Sahih al-Bukhari until 850, 860. So in fairness, the Abbasids, as they're trying to grapple with a lot of the what we now see to be orthodox core bedrock theological elements of Islam, are not really as settled at that time. You don't even have the idea of a hadith being mawdu' and fabricated or sahih. You and me can have a hadith that we've memorized in 775, and it's actually a mawdu' hadith, but we don't know it yet. Well, and that's what was so important about these imma, right? That like the Imam Malik's and the Imam Abu Hanifa's, they were the hadith, they were the compass. These are the people that allowed you to know, well, what they were clearly doing what Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim would do later on. That's right. But it wasn't done in a mass production type of way where everybody could just open up a book and be like, oh, this is sahih, this is da'if, this is mawdu'. In those days, you actually had to be smart and actually had to have a sharp memory. Yeah, right. And so the ulama played such an important role in crystallizing theological tradition. So at this time, you have the Abbasis starting to get very intellectual, very smart in ways that Umayyads were not. Umayyads were into wealth, expansion. Militarily, they were exceptional. I don't think the Abbasids can hold the candles to what they accomplished on the military side. They actually just inherited a lot of the fruits of the Umayyads' labor, but they were incredibly intelligent, and they were intellectual, and they understood the importance of the arts. They understood the importance of reading. They created the first widespread book culture in the medieval period.
they monopolized maybe 70% of the world's books were kept in Baghdad for most of this middle period. An offshoot of that is the son of Harun al-Rashid, Abdullah al-Ma'mun, the older son, the son of the concubine, is actually very knowledgeable, very learned, and he's one of the early adopters of looking at ancient Greek philosophy and trying to apply that to Islamic theology and aqidah. And really, in fairness to him, the Orthodoxy and the ulema of that time, it's so early stage, they haven't really been able to formulate a proper response to these new innovative elements in theology, such that you could say what he is doing, al-Ma'mun, is actually heretical at the time. It's not readily apparent that what he's doing is that far outside the box. But here are some of the things that al-Ma'mun comes to believe in, because he's a follower of the Mu'tazilite philosophy. So they might believe, in fact, that, or in fact they do, they believe that the Qur'an is a creation that was crafted at a certain point in time for a certain purpose. Al-Qur'an makhluq. They believe that Allah Azza wa Jal, because he says in the Qur'an, Inna Allah la yukhliful mi'ad, God doesn't go back on his promise. Therefore, if you follow the Qur'an and Hadith, it is beyond God's capabilities to not hold you to account, which is, again, heresy, because as a Muslim, the core fundamental thing you believe is it's always up to God. I don't know how God's going to judge me. He can go back on his promise. That's his discretion. We're just hoping for salvation and that he loves us, and we pray for his mercy and that he honors his word. We're entirely at his whim. There's no appeal process if he doesn't want to be merciful.
We're his slave ultimately.
We're his, exactly. There's other ideas where he wants to apply an overly rationalist lens to interpreting the Qur'an. When the Qur'an talks about God sitting on his throne, or God having a hand, he says, well, if it doesn't make sense to me rationally, then I'm going to read it as being symbolic or metaphorical. And that's actually not how the Qur'an is supposed to be read. When God says certain things, when he tells certain stories, if they appear to go against the laws of science or the zahiri, the apparent world as it's presented to us, we still have to assume that it actually happened the way it did. God doesn't fake stories or make parables purely for narrational purposes. It actually is supposed to be taken as the eternal truth and the kalamullah, the eternal word of God. These are things that the Mu'tazilites believe in, and they start to really catch on in the early 9th century. So by the time Amin and Ma'mun are in full swing in the fourth Fitna, these ideas are very prevalent within the Ummah, and they're really trendy and en vogue because we've got these new bodies of scripture and manuscripts coming from Greece of these ancient philosophers, and they seem like a really cool application to the Qur'an. So you have this sort of heresy creeping in. So let's move forward to Harun al-Rashid's reign from 786 to 809. In his private memoirs, he definitely seems to favor al-Ma'mun because Ma'mun is brilliant, very learned, he's very religious. Again, we can say from our retrospective lens that he was heretically religious, but he was very religious. It meant a lot to him, which is the ultimate irony here. Amin is not religious at all. As we mentioned, he was a fasiq, he was a sot, he was a drunkard, and a lot of the courtiers of the day were also offended, or the people were offended by what appeared to be even homosexual practices. That wasn't en vogue for the people of Baghdad in the 9th century. And it was against the prevailing norms of Islamic rulings and theology. So Ma'mun and Amin could not be more opposite. The challenge with al-Amin is he's the first Abbasi prince that is fully Abbasi on both sides, because his mother, Zubaydah, is the daughter of Ja'far, who is the son of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. That's
serious lineage.
Harun al-Rashid is the exact same, his father. He's from Mahdi, who was the son of I believe, Abu Ja'far. They were both Abbasis, through and through. So he's a purebred. The Abbasi courtiers love him, and they go, we don't care if the other guy's more qualified to rule. This is a pure bred Abbasi. He is the guy that should rule.
Or they go back to that.
They go back to
They always go back.
the Jahiliyyah.
Yeah.
These guys are all Jahils.
That's what's so comical about the whole thing. When you really go through the pages, and I don't want to take away from anything, but
yeah,
it's really unbelievable.
Totally. So Harun privately in his memoirs is writing that al-Ma'mun is way more qualified. And he realizes that Ma'mun is smarter, Ma'mun is more pious, he is way more fit to rule than Amin, and Amin is just going to run the Khilafah or the empire off the rails if he's in charge. But he's under so much pressure to appoint Amin as his successor that he comes up with what he thinks is a fair way of distributing power. And in all the instances of history that I've studied where somebody tries to split up a kingdom and get everyone to get along, it's always going to be a disaster.
It never works.
And he even says this in his memoirs. He goes, I sense that my sons have blood coming soon. He knows that nothing good is going to come out of this, but he doesn't know what to do because he feels that his hand is forced into making al-Amin the next Caliph in Baghdad. But what he does do is give Khorasan and the eastern provinces from where Ma'mun's mother is, Khorasan, northeast, the Afghanistan area. He gives them governorship of that. And he makes them sign a pact that they'll both coexist and get along. And he is so serious about this pact that he has it hung inside the Kaaba. And in his late campaigns, 807, 808, he still takes Ma'mun with him because he just trusts him more and he wants him to learn more. And he thinks that he will be the voice of reason in the Khilafah. But ultimately, it was naive because they were never going to get along, as he well knew himself. 808, 809 comes along. Harun al-Rashid dies. Zubaydah does survive. She's the mother of Amin. She's in Baghdad with him. But the brothers have beef.
The drama begins.
The drama begins. Over time, al-Amin tries to take over everything. He becomes more and more aggressive and feels threatened by Ma'mun, and Ma'mun is growing in his power, even in his limited province of Khorasan, because he's just more fit to rule. You have a smart leader. He's Abbasi. He's a son of the last Caliph that everybody loved. And al-Amin is the exact opposite. He's not religious, and he's not really from this area.
And Amin right now is currently acting.
The Caliph.
He's an acting Khalifa right
He is
now.
the Caliph.
Yeah.
He's the king of the Abbasid Empire. So they end up having beef. They struggle. And so about 3 years into his rule, al-Amin decides to renege on the entire agreement hanging inside the Kaaba. He actually famously goes in and tears up the entire thing. So the deal is off. I'm the Khalif of everything. Obviously, al-Ma'mun's not too happy about that. So he starts devising ways that he can kind of get back at him. Al-Amin tries to preemptively send money and resources to members of his eastern and northeastern provinces and governors to shore them up so that they can ultimately take over the Khorasan province and do away with al-Amin. Reports are that he wants to kill him and execute him and end this thing once and for all. But the mistake that he makes is he sends up to 100,000 dirhams of gold with his general Ali ibn Isa, who is one of his biggest loyalist supporters. He's an Abbasi, he's Abbasi all the way through, one of his great advisors and trusted people. And his job is to dispense of that money and those resources to all the different governors so that they can strengthen themselves and get ready for an offensive to take out the rebellion or the remnants of dissent that is al-Ma'mun. And equally challenging on the Ma'mun side, as Ma'mun is isolated, he doesn't have the resources that the Abbasi Khilafah does. His men are seasoned veterans, but they're not even close to being as well equipped as the Abbasi imperial troops are. They have no money. They're running out. They're almost in siege in some ways.
Yeah, he's a governor basically trying to fight the country. You know what I mean?
And
the odds are not there.
Resources, less money. He's got less troops who are less trained and less equipped. It is not looking good. So when al-Amin starts to mobilize, you can see the writing on the wall for Ma'mun. Ma'mun actually dispatches one of his generals, Tahir al-Khurasani, Tahir ibn Ali. Tahir actually, through his scouts, finds out that this massive army of 50,000 Abbasid imperial troops is carrying what appears to be a very large sum of money. And for medieval military warfare, that is a bit unusual because typically you wouldn't have all of your eggs in one basket.
Mm-hmm.
You would typically have money move very quickly under cover of darkness where nobody realizes that there's this big procession with millions of dollars.
Yeah, you don't want to get stolen or,
Yeah, in this case,
it's wide open.
Tahir's recon team just looks at the army and they're all together in one column and they've got all this loot. So let's attack them. So he actually cuts off this army expedition at Rai, the Battle of Rai in 812. And so the Abbasi, when I say Abbasi, I mean the imperial side of Al-Amin, are very arrogant in every which way because they just think that the other side is a rebellion. And they understand what we do now, that the odds are really stacked against them. They're not really strong. They're not really that much of a threat at this point because he's got about 50,000 strong. And Tahir on the other side has 10,000. And they are not even close to being as equipped or trained as well as his troops are. So it's a no-brainer for him. It's a shoo-in. It's like, okay, fine, you can attack me. What they don't know, though, is Tahir is cut from the cloth of KBW or Baybars, and he's got a lot of the same tactics. So what he initially does is he pulls his troops back, and this is a pitched battle at one point, Battle of Rai, and the Abbasid imperial troops just push forward, trying to smash them with the weight of their numbers. So he falls back, very familiar if you study KBW, Khalid ibn Walid, or Baybars. He just pulls back and starts circling around. And he focuses his men on the center column where the general Ali ibn Isa is, or Isa ibn Ali. I always get that confused. One of those two.
Yeah, two first names. It's tricky.
And all of his main cadre are right there with the money. He focuses right on the center and he keeps circling around. Brilliant game plan. And he has one of his archers hit Ali ibn Isa through the eye and kill him. And then all of his generals and central command are cut down at the same time. That basically makes the Abbasid imperial troops the headless horsemen. Panic sets in, and it's a total rout and decimation. But more so than the victory on the battlefield is now the starving, deprived army has enough resources in gold to last 3-4 years. And now the opposing army that was preventing them from marshaling the resources in the periphery,
now they have
now out of the way. So this changes everything. What was a 2% probability of victory for Ma'mun, now you're looking at 85-90%. It's almost a done deal going the other way. This was never supposed to happen. Even Al-Amin is shocked. How did this happen?
Yeah. What luck.
Within a couple of years, they are besieging Baghdad. They besiege it for a year and a half. It ultimately falls. Al-Amin is executed. According to Al-Ma'mun, he didn't want his brother to be killed. There's different reports from Al-Tabari ibn Kathir, whether he rejoiced or whether he was sad. Some people say he cried. These are all legitimate ulema and historians. What we do take away is he did make dua. He did feel some remorse, and he buried Al-Amin's head, washing it, giving it a ghusl the way a Muslim would. So he was not a horrible man. I think he was well-intentioned, but he was a heretic. And over time, he probably became disillusioned and misled by his own power and just trying to consolidate things into his hands. And he added to the Mu'tazilite philosophy by the end of his reign, where he felt that the Caliph should be the judge, jury, theologian, and executioner. He wanted a true theocracy where he is the ulema, he is the qadi, and he is the Caliph. Whereas in classic Islamic theology and political theory, the Caliph is actually the executor of the law, not the law maker. He's the follower and the implementer of the law, much like the president of the U.S. He doesn't actually make law. He has executive orders, but law is set by Congress. His job is to follow the law and enforce it, and the law and the constitution is actually the shariah. And the people want to make sure that the Caliph is following the shariah, and the arbiter of that is the ulema, and that comes out of the Mihna period. So you fast forward to 813, al-Amin is dead. And it's a very interesting story that Ma'mun, when he moves back into Baghdad, his stepmother, Zubaydah, actually takes him in and understands that he's probably more qualified to rule. And she probably had conversations with her late husband, Harun, saying, yeah, you know, the first guy is more meant to rule. And I forgot to mention this. Al-Ma'mun is actually the older one. So it's a total slight for him to not be the one that gets
on
the nod.
every metric.
It's
Struggling.
It doesn't make any sense. The Abbasids just wanted that thoroughbred to be the one that rules. So now you've got this entire change in the complexion of Islamic history. Al-Ma'mun was never supposed to rule. He does end up ruling. And instead of having a very apathetic, unreligious guy that couldn't care less what Islamic creed or theology was, you've got a religious zealot who is heretical that now wants to reshape the entire course and complexion of Islamic theology and creed, which, again, is ironic in terms of how it plays out. Al-Ma'mun, in the final year of his considerably eventful rule, he does a pretty good job overall. In 833, he decrees, which seems odd for a Muslim now, he decrees that Mu'tazilite Aqidah is the Aqidah of Islam and of the realm. And anybody that goes against that is committing a crime. So he's actively now meddling in theology and trying to set it. And he has his own chief qadis and his own ulema who are all Mu'tazili, based on this Greek philosophy and stuff like that. And the Orthodox ulema, Imam Ahmad, Imam Abu Hanifa, the four A'immas, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, all these great ulama and A'imma are obviously on the other side. Most of them have passed, but now you've got a new cadre around Imam Ahmad that are absolutely against this.
Can I?
Please jump in.
I don't know how well the history is written on this subject, but I'm wondering, was there any percentage of belief that Al-Ma'mun would have been a better Caliph because he wasn't a heretic, that he would leave it up to the people? Does that ever play in? Or is that...
You mean Al-Amin?
Al-Amin, sorry. That Al-Amin is actually better because...
You have a sample size. He was there for 3-4 years, and he was doing all the same things that you would think a fool like him would do.
No, but in terms of ruling of the land, because it's kind of
generally speaking, this is just going to be yours or my take.
Yeah, I see.
But generally speaking, this is very similar to the Ottomans after fratricide. We have a whole episode on that.
It's great.
But you have people that take over the helm after nothing but debauchery and no training and no religiosity. They're really not qualified to rule. Generally, you're going to have bad outcomes. But what I mean is that guy.
What I'm leading to is that from I don't want to foreshadow, but arguably, both of them technically would have taken you down a terrible road. Is the way I see it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
The way I see it is God wanted Ma'mun to rule because he wanted the Mihna to happen because of the rule of law that would result from the Mihna.
Right.
In some ways, if I can synthesize it into a sentence, God wanted the heretic to take over because he would pick a fight with the ulama that would ultimately and ironically give the power and the orthodoxy back to the people and the ulama, which would create the ultimate counterbalance historically that shaped Islamic civilization. That is, in a nutshell, what the Mihna represented.
Yeah,
because then
you're right.
Al-Mu'tasim comes in, and Al-Mu'tasim is a very famous Abbasid Caliph. So all these guys have blood on their hands in terms of the Mihna. Mu'tasim comes in, and he starts enforcing the creed of his brother, the decree that he passed right before he died. And obviously, the first person he sets his sights on is Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Imam Ahmad is called to the palace, 833, 834, and he is forced to say that al-Qur'an makhluq. And Imam Ahmad says, absolutely not over my dead body. Al-Qur'an kalamullah ila al-abad. It's always eternally going to be the word of God. Nothing you say or do or whip me with is going to change that. And rahimahullah, he is whipped so terribly that he passes out, and when he wakes up, he's in a prison cell. And they come and they torture him and they beat him every day, to the point where other ulama start to come on with the program. They're like, yeah, we're all good with the Mu'tazilite philosophy. It makes sense. It's rational. Yeah, all that stuff. Imam Ahmad never gives in. He never gives in.
A lot of famous ulama actually give in. Like everyone was giving in.
There's probably some people trying to do
Yeah.
duqiyya, where they're kind of going along and opposing it. Imam Ahmad's like, no. Somebody famously comes to visit him in his prison cell saying, Imam, just go along with the program because you can't oppose these guys. They're just going to kill you. And then all your knowledge and legacy will die with you. At least you can forestall things and maybe you can get in their ear and change their philosophy a bit over time. He goes, no. Take a look outside my prison cell. The entire city is waiting for Ahmad to agree so that the entire orthodoxy of Islam can change and the deen of Allah can be turned on its head. I'm never going to do that. As time goes on, his resistance becomes very symbolic because the people are watching Mu'tasim and they're saying, why does this all-powerful Caliph need the validation of this gray-bearded man that he's got clearly in a prison cell under control? What's the problem? Is that man's arbitration that important to him? Maybe I should understand what he is all about. And Imam Ahmad, I'm oversimplifying it, he was a legend before he went in, which is entirely why Mu'tasim wanted to marshal him and co-opt him. But the movement only grows and grows. Over time, Mu'tasim becomes very embarrassed because everywhere he goes, everyone's looking at him like, what's happening with Imam Ahmad? If you have your philosophy, that's fine, but this is Imam Ahmad. What's your problem? And other ulama are actually executed for following in Imam Ahmad's footsteps and saying, absolutely not. Imam Ahmad starts a whole movement of people saying, absolutely not. The Orthodoxy, the Qur'an, is the eternal kalamullah. You're never going to be able to change it. And ultimately where the Abbasids are going with it, and the ulama see this, is they want to start using the Qur'an to then legitimate their rule. They're going to start changing ayahs or rationally interpreting it to say the Abbasids are the Ahl al-Bayt and therefore they should be the ones to rule. Whatever kings do when they're given the opportunity. But it only goes the other way. It only gets worse for the Abbasids. Al-Wathiq, the next Caliph after Mu'tasim, and at this point, actually, Imam Ahmad has been freed because Mu'tasim's so embarrassed, but he makes a pact with Imam Ahmad that you're just going to keep it silent.
Yeah, to stay home.
Just stay home. Yeah, you're under house arrest, but I'll let you go because this has become a huge fadiha for me. Fadiha, you're just going to be out there. Al-Wathiq comes out and he goes, the winds are not on the side of the Mihna here. I'm only going to enforce it among bureaucrats and political actors. So it's kind of like the bill they have in Quebec. Religious symbols, they can't apply it to everybody. They just say if you work for the government, and in a society like that where everybody is working for the government in some shape or form, it has pretty good reach and ambit. So that's what Al-Wathiq does, but clearly they're starting to pull back the reins. 848, Al-Mutawakkil comes in and he abolishes it entirely. He says this is a lost cause. There's maybe a mixed bag of reports as to why he does that. Some believe that he is actually an orthodox, pious man. Some believe that he's just reading the political winds. Who knows? These guys were kings at the end of the day. Ironically, we talked about this in the Mamluk episode. For all the good things Mutawakkil did, he's actually killed by his own ghilman in Saman-Ra as part of that mutiny. And that mutiny, in addition to the Mihna, forever destabilizes the Abbasi Khilafah. And the Caliphs are never that powerfully, and it becomes so decentralized after the ghilman just take things over. Not just because of the ghilman, but because the Mihna itself now makes the ulama equally powerful as well. So everything from this point forward is going through the lens of the ulama. Anything to do with property, tax, succession, mu'amalat, these are all things that the Aqidah speaks to and is part of its jurisdiction. So any rule of a Khalif is subject to be challenged by a Qadi and by a Mufti after the fact. And I think we should stop right there and pause and reflect on how this Mihna, or the fourth Fitna in Islamic history, being so improbable in its outcome changed the entire course of history, because if Amin continues to rule, he probably doesn't pick the fight with the ulema, and you probably don't have the ulema crystallizing and calcifying into this entire ex officio organ that ends up controlling indirectly and checking the actions of the executive. It is one of the most incredible developments in the medieval period. Dr. Noah Feldman of Harvard has an entirely amazing book on this called The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, where he talks about how the golden period and all the accomplishments of the Muslims in the medieval period were because this counterbalanced, that every single Caliph and Sultan had to go through this entire process. And there are many examples. Let's mention just a few off the top. The Mamluks. We talked about this in our Mamluk episode, and it's very important that people get a chance to go watch that. The Mamluks had their own way of appointing an Amir and a Sultan. They had Amir al-Miya, Amir al-Alf. They'd have their elite lords, who were actually slaves, would pick a ruler among them. But that ruler would then have to go to the Dar al-Qadha among the muftis and the judges and be grilled, basically like a Senate confirmation hearing in the U.S. And if the ulama and the muftis didn't like that person based on what they were hearing, and let's be honest, they were mostly grilling them based on their theology and their knowledge and whether they were going to fulfill the function of the executor and implementer of Islamic law as arbeited by them. If they didn't pass that test, they wouldn't get the fatwa, and the khutbah the next day at Jum'ah or at Salah would not reflect his name, so the people would know that this man has not been ratified. So, for example, in 1381, under the Mamluks, al-Baruquh is one of the first sultans that goes, I don't need a fatwa, I'm not going to follow the process. He knifes somebody, he takes over, and the ulama are kind of like, you're not following the process. And in fact, you usurped power without the authority. There wasn't a shariah basis for you to take over. So we don't give you a fatwa. He doesn't get the support that he needs. He goes, you know what, forget you guys. I don't need you anyways. I'm the sultan, this and that. I got the army, the military. Ulama are like, okay, fine, but you don't have our blessing. Within 5-10 years, a rebellion starts brewing. All the other amirs and the people don't consider him to have the legitimacy to rule. In 1389, there's a rebellion and he's overthrown.
That's what happens.
That's what happens. If you don't have the legitimacy to rule, people, sure, you have the army and the power, but you're just basically on borrowed time.
Yeah.
That was like al-Baruquh.
And I think it's so, it's such a great thing that actually happened when you break it down, because in the beginning, the people that were guided were religious figures, right? They were, quote unquote, these were the rightly guided people, right? So after that, it became kings and land and all this sort of thing. Like this, it's just, let's get rich, to put it simplistically.
Yeah.
But the people kept feeling something was missing. That anytime that someone would come over to take over, it ended up always becoming me and my people and my wealth, whatever it was, no matter how it was presented. And having this opportunity, it's almost like this God-given chance for the people to be guided as, morally possible as would presume. Like, if the ulama were all on board on something decent, then it should be decent. You know what I mean? Like, it became, they took a little bit of power away, because until that time, the kings had all the power, right? It was even though they were not a theocracy, they were still very much making the rules.
Yeah, the ulama didn't have the power before the Mihna.
That's right.
Openly oppose and have the people looking at the Caliph and say, what are you doing?
That's right.
Does it say what you're doing?
It gave room to challenge.
Exactly. And it gets more formal over time. The Mamluks. So the Abbasis, after the Mihna, the Caliphs aren't even that strong anymore. It's very decentralized. You have it fractionalized into different splinters. And we're going to have a very lengthy episode of the journey of the Khilafah, where we get into all the pretenders and the contenders. You've got the Fatimids, you've got the Umayyad Spain dynasty that are calling themselves the Caliphs. The Abbasis become very weak. So they're probably not the best example of a Khalif being checked by the ulema because they weren't even that strong to begin with. But the ulema being so strong is part of the reason why they're not that strong. But when you look at the Mamluks and the Ottomans, these people took it to the next level because those sultans were very strong. They were very popular. They were great generals. They were defenders of Islam. They were very religious, and they were still checked by the ulama. The Mamluks actually create a waqf, a foundation, a trust of properties and income generating assets that runs on its own and is self-sustaining, that perpetuates the Dar al-Qada and the Dar al-Ifta. So they've got muftis that are passing fatwas based on what the sultan is doing, and the Dar al-Qada is the judges that are judging the actions based on the fatwas that are coming out. So a lot of times, if a sultan was going to be giving a ruling or an edict exercising his executive authority on a matter salient to the shariah, property, tax, succession, even change of authority and power, it was usually referred to the ulama first. What's your take on this? Is this okay? Can you pass a fatwa? Is this okay? And if they didn't follow that process, it could actually be challenged by a person in the Dar al-Qada saying, why did the Khalif or the Sultan do this? He doesn't have the authority. What do you think? Ya Imma, ya Shuyukh. And then it was subject to challenge. One of the great examples of this was under the Ottoman period. Mehmet the Great, Al-Fatih, has a dispute with one of his architects, and he feels that there's some wrongdoing. Some people feel that there was a dispute about what timelines should have been followed by the architect. He actually chops his hand off. So the man goes to the Qadi and he sues Mehmet the Great in a civil proceeding. Mehmet the Great has to appear in court without his regalia as a regular dude. He shows up and he loses. The judge says, how could you just chop off his hand without considering the facts and this and that? And he actually has to pay him compensation for his lost hand. And then you fast forward to Mehmet the Great's son, Bayezid II, who was actually a pretty capable sultan. He was the one that actually resettled the Jews and the Muslims when Andalusian Spain fell in 1492. He actually had emissaries go and collect them and resettle them in the Ottoman Empire. He did a lot of really good things. He was the son of Mehmet the Great. Bayezid, near the end, was almost incapacitated. He had lost all his energy. He wasn't doing a very good job. His son, Salim al-Awwal, Salim the Resolute, the father of Suleiman al-Qanuni, Suleiman the Magnificent, Salim al-Awwal wants his dad's job and he thinks he can do a better job at it. But because matters of succession are matters of sharia, you can't just take power without following the shari'i way of doing so. He has to vie before the qadis and the ulama for the fatwa to replace his father. So finally in 1512, he gets that fatwa where the ulama say, yes, Bayezid is no longer fit to rule because he's not able to implement the law the way he once did. Therefore, he must accede to his son. And Bayezid accepts, even though he is supposedly the sultan with absolute authority. This concept of sultans and khalifs having absolute authority, that is actually a Euro-Westernocentric perspective of our history and our political theory and system. Because the ulama are not actual state actors, the way that Congress is or the judiciary is formally appointed, they don't appreciate or acknowledge the extent to which they absolutely factor into the entire suite of checks and balances against the executive. This is literally an example where the Khalif is being replaced, the Sultan is, by a fatwa purely based or primarily based on his ability to follow and implement the Islamic law. There's a succession change caused by a fatwa, and the Khalif follows it. Suleiman al-Qanuni, the grandson of Bayezid, the son of Salim al-Awwal, he's famously known on many occasions to have lost or had his edict overturned by the Mufti al-Azim, because by then you actually have a Shaykh al-Islam, and he says, when the ulama pass a fatwa, the Sultan must follow. And this is the Sultan who's called the Qanuni, the lawgiver, the lawmaker. He actually isn't passing laws of his own. He's just implementing the laws of the Sharia that the judges who are entirely independent of him and are purely judging against the constitution that is the Qur'an and the Hadith and the corpus of our theological tradition, as the base by which to judge all the actions. So what you have, in ways that Western academic think don't really understand, and Noah Feldman understands this, and a lot of scholars who probably don't get the airtime they should do understand, is this is probably the first instance of a constitutional monarchy where the constitution was the shariah. And I know people want to say, oh, that's still a theocracy. No, a theocracy is where you have a ruler that is infallible. This is actually checks and balances. A man is being given a position. He's considered a deputy. He is a deputy of the Sharia, and his power derives entirely and solely from his ability to implement and execute that law. And the moment he stops doing that, he no longer has his legitimacy to rule. This is not at all a theocracy. It's a constitutional monarchy with a body of law that rules. So it's a form of rule of law. Now, it's not rule of law to the organic degree that we have today, where you and I on an infinitesimal level can't have, forget the Caliph, the local municipality, we can sue them if they start taking away our right to mow the lawn. There's a process to everything. It's been really granularized. But the pioneers of that were actually the purveyors of the Sharia in the medieval Islamic period, of the Mamluks and the Ottomans and the late Abbasi period. And this is all a brainchild of the Mihna, which was never supposed to happen because Ma'mun, the religious zealot heretic, was never supposed to be in power. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think that
those great tide turnings in history that you couldn't have predicted. And it absolutely was not supposed to be that way.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, is that sometimes things happen, and even when it does happen, you still think it's bad, but the resounding results will surprise you.
Absolutely.
Right? That's kind of how it goes. So I think,
in a nutshell, that is the family feud, the Abbasi dynasty, their internal politics, the mihna that they tried to create and trying to marshal the ulema onto their side, and how it backfired so poorly for them, but it worked out so tremendously well for not just Islamic civilization, but I would argue the history of rule of law, because it became a case study in how that could actually work.
Yeah, and I think that's what helped prevail so many of these modern day democracies. It gave the foundation of, okay, how do we govern people while still having power, but at the same time having the people feel that they got something.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
No,
and there are going to be people saying, well, but the Constitution is secular and the Sharia is a theological body of law. I would argue that every constitution or legal framework has some normative morality to it, whether you want to call it religion, whether you want to say that it belongs to a secular set of laws. I know with certainty that the U.S. framework is religious in base. You've got the Ten Commandments, you've got Christian values, biblical, that are at the source and the root of the Constitution. The Sharia is no different. But what sets the Sharia apart as a predecessor to the U.S. system of constitutional rule of law is that it's an entirely external, objective set of standards that is arbeited and founded by an entirely different independent class of actors who then hold the executive to account against that. And the people are entirely on board.
Yeah, and I think that is the difference. Like, you articulated it so well, but just to really notch it down one more time is the idea that in America, you have the two governing bodies, but they're all part of the government. They still fall all in together. They still play all together, right? And therefore, what ends up happening is you have this corruption that can happen because everybody's feeding each other. But when you have this completely separate tentacle, if you will, this whole other arm of government that has nothing to do with this, but can still impose and implement and reject, it makes things better for the whole world. And I think that's what's really, and I think the word Sharia gets a really bad rep for this because, whatever the West has deemed Sharia law to be, or the Eastern Europe powers, or whoever it may be, have decided that this is the boogeyman term. But it still seems that if you look at history, realistically speaking, you gave so much power to the people via this mechanism, because it's a separate branch of the government now. It has nothing to do with the executive branch. Like it's completely separate. So there's no bribery, there's no lobbying, if you will. It's just a separate entity. So the government's doing its thing, susceptible to all sorts of foreplay, if you will. Whereas this ulema, the people implementing the sharia, these people are just calling it out. Their job is to call it out. Their job is to be representing the people. The people like it. And it gives this feeling, or at least it tries to keep it consistent, keep it fair, keep it good for everybody.
Yep. So, and I think you hit on a very important motive that maybe we should touch upon before we break. And it's this idea that Western thinkers and polemics have, that the sharia itself is some shadowy, dark, evil body of law, and jizya is a tool of oppression used by sharia. If you look at historically, jizya reflects a system that was incredibly unique, maybe the only one of its kind in the medieval period, where religious minorities had a constitutionally protected right to not only exist, but have their own religion, have their own culture and norms, and be judged by their own books and their own scriptures. There's a reason why in the medieval period you're not going to find masjids in the Roman Empire. We weren't even allowed to exist, let alone have a constitutionally protected right to be there.
Nobody
if you had those times, you might have situations as a one-off where Jewish people are allowed to live in one part of the world because there was a good magnanimous king. But when his son took over, he might have been a bigot and he wanted to kill them all. Or Muslims lived in some part of Central Europe and they were allowed to for 20 years, and another mad king came in and we were finished. The difference here, because we're talking about the constitutional rule of law as arbeited by the ulema, from sultan to sultan, if I'm Murad and I like Christians and Jews, and then my son Mehmet doesn't like them, it doesn't matter. Because the sharia allows for minorities, Christians and Jews, to live. They pay jizya, which is a tax that they pay in exchange for being able to live, and they don't have to serve in the armed forces. And on the Muslim side, we pay zakat and we pay ushur, which is property taxes, where you have to tithe 1/10 of your wealth or your property. We're paying tax on both sides of the equation. Jizya as a tax is part of a system that is constitutionally protecting from generation to generation, from sultan to sultan, khalif to khalif, the right to exist and live safely on Muslim lands. And again, if a sultan or a khalif tries to oppress minorities in a way that goes against the sharia, and the sharia definitely protected their right to exist. There was cases like Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab. He took jizya from people in Syria, and then it became apparent that they were going to lose the city back to the Roman counter-revolutionaries, or the counter-attack. They actually gave the jizya back to the people, saying, we took it to protect you and we can't protect you anymore. This is the Islamic way for people that actually study it from a not polemic perspective, from a sober, center of the way angle.
And I think a lot of people dismiss the fact of how important it was to protect these minorities in countries. Like, people ignore the fact, and you alluded to it, but people ignore that when you were a minority in a country, you were always killed. Your books were burned. Your things were destroyed. Everything about you
were subject to the whims of the king. If he didn't like you one day, you woke up. Look at the biblical period. The Israelites wake up one day, and there's so many instances where a king is being petitioned by people to kill them. Right? I'm paraphrasing the Old Testament and the Tanakh.
Yeah,
there's so many instances like that. It's constant.
Yeah, it's a constant. So that's the thing that's people really underscore, because now when you're looking at history, thousands of years later, it's like, oh, I can move here, I can move there. I have that wasn't the norm back in the day. That is probably something that if you actually go down to its derivatives and find out where it actually comes from, that was probably an Islamic philosophy that has paved the way for people to actually have.
Well, it was definitely a predecessor case study. So you can say whatever you want about etymologically, it didn't actually come from that, and they weren't studying the Islamic model, whatever. But the forerunner in terms of constitutional rule of law in its infantile or primitive form was absolutely the Sharia system under the Mamluks and the Abbasis, the Ottomans. And this isn't coming from me. This is coming from academic scholars. Definitely go ahead, read Noah Feldman. There's so many other sources that we can share with people, but this is historic fact that they don't teach you in history because it's not convenient to the narrative.
Well, I was even watching an episode yesterday on YouTube. I was watching one historian say that when they talk about world history, the first whole semester is basically about Rome and Greek.
Yeah.
Right. And then the next semester, and this is again world history, they'll go and spend most of the time in different parts of the world. Post-Enlightenment.
Modern.
And they will just glaze over whatever contributions the Arabian Muslim land done. That's, a day and a half tops.
Yep.
So, I think if people really want to understand how society got from A to Z, that they're watching this podcast is something, but I think there was a lot of reading that is required. There's a lot of deep diving that people need to do.
So in many ways, if we could wrap it up, the rule of law tradition that we hold so sacred today in Western conscience owes at least some of its existence to its predecessor, that was the Sharia system in the medieval period, which entirely is the brainchild of the Mihna that was never supposed to happen, because the forgotten son, who was the ultimate underdog and a heretic, but a religious guy at that, won and pushed the buttons of the ulema and picked a fight with somebody that he wasn't going to beat.
And that's all the time we have for you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you again next week on the Sayings of Time podcast.